we had the actors representing you know, the followers of the golden years, or whatever it was, were at least a generation older than any of you seem to be. So we slightly mocked that, I suppose. And what was felt by the fraternity, and of course I was both in the fraternity and not in the fraternity, was that the play had betrayed it. And that was largely because the final scene, which I've referred to, becomes extremely explosive in its content. And what the final scene is that there are speeches. As I say, it's so like in many ways what we're doing here today. There are speeches, there are clips played, and you know, people remember Al and Lou. And the main speech is to be given by the young, he's the only one who is within 30 or 40 years of anybody else who seems to be there, the part played by Ian Home, the young secretary of the society, who has to, you know, lead the faithful into the last dance. And he goes off the rails. And I would also say, being myself of a mischievous trainer, I'm tempted to go off the rails here and now, because it somehow echoes the play, but I'll try not to do that. And what he does, because he's a very troubled figure, and I won't bother you with the background plot, he's had a very tough day, and he's been to a national health psychiatrist who prescribes pills and says, above all, whatever you do, don't drink and don't eat cheese. He says, why? He said, don't eat cheese. But I don't know if he had cheese, but he certainly drank. And by the time he gets to the big event, he's a little bit out of control. So he starts his speech, which is very conventional. We remember the years when everything was lovely and all the songs were about love. Pause. Never about sex. And the room freezes, and I have to say that the golden years world of that time froze as well, because I think it was very, very difficult for anyone to see beyond the literal, if you like, beauty and sentimentality of that material, to see that, or remember that the world of the 30s was as dissolute and as libertarian, really, although the official record says differently, as we are now. So Dennis was lifting a veil, and at the same time he was making available to an audience which didn't know about it, that music. I mean, it was a period when there was a sprinkling of EPs and LPs, but not very much, particularly of British stuff, and there hadn't been any explosion. And of course, it was not Moonlight on the Highway that affected the explosion, it was Pennies from Heaven that came later. But in Moonlight on the Highway, there was one very brief moment, which is almost accidental, where our hero, the Ian Home, the young man, is awaiting the visit of a glamorous television researcher to his place, and feeling quite nervous, and he goes to the mirror, and there's a Bowley track playing, I think it's Lover Come Back to Me, and he mumbles the words, just a fragment. And at that point, we had not thought about doing that at all on a large scale, and didn't really know what it implied, but it clearly was going to imply a great deal for the way we used that material in Pennies from Heaven. And of course, what the young man does when he gets into his speech is make a very, very, as I said earlier, explosive confession about his own life. And it's a confession, I mean, I can say this now to you, although this confession has been toxic for me through the years, because people think I invented it in Dennis's real life, rather than remember he put it in a play. But Dennis certainly had some kind of horrible sexual period when he slept with a lot of prostitutes. I say Dennis had that because he told me, and he told other people, and he put it into 2 plays, one of which I rejected because it was very dreary as a piece, and then he went away and came back, and we talked about it, and of course it's the music which humanises what he is saying, because the message, insofar as a piece has to have a message, is quite the opposite, I think, of what the faithful assumed at the time. It wasn't rejecting and rubbishing the material, or the sounds of Al Bowley or Lou. It was endorsing it, because he's got no comfort from the psychiatrist, no comfort from anything else in his life, but here is a context in which, ridiculously and drunkenly, he feels he can confide in these people, and that's a grotesque social mistake, but he does so, and at the end, he says, good old Al. You know, so what you're supposed to feel is that he has gained succour and comfort from that music in his life, which he wouldn't have gained if it hadn't been there. But we were, I think, quite basically misunderstood, and the play was in any case not very well received for other reasons. That this was a period when everyone was getting off on Jean-Luc Godard and you know, the Beatles and all that, and so this piece had a really kind of strange ambience about it, it took some time for the piece to be at all valued. And I wouldn't claim it's one of Dennis's best plays, but it is a piece of epoch making, and it was a very terrific thing to do. And then a few years later, Pennies from Heaven came along, and I don't need or want particularly talk very much about that, but just to say that the evolution of Pennies from Heaven reflected something in the wider media world, which sadly is no longer the case, that well, the BBC particularly, and not only the BBC, ITV as well, because, as I say, we Night in the High was made for a London weekend, and Dennis and I and other people would flip to and fro from these various companies, and we were always welcomed. We were welcomed not because we necessarily got 11 million viewers, although sometimes we did, but because there was a climate of wanting new and interesting material, and you could do it. And you could do it more or less without having to account to a big boss along the corridor until it was too late. Of course, there were limitations on that, but on the whole, that's how it was. And Pennies from Heaven came out 2 years after a year in which I had produced 3 plays by Dennis, one of which was banned for over a decade, and that was Brimstone and Treacle. And if anyone remembers, I won't bother to tell you why it was banned, although I can be told quite simply. And in the wake of that, there was an attempt to purge me from the BBC, not for that reason, but because they thought everyone was a lefty and they had to get the pick on some. And that failed, that attempt to purge, but Brimstone had been banned, and Dennis was furious. It got the better of the publicity, but the BBC never apologised, never explained as publicly as it possibly can, and so we were kind of in the wilderness. And in the middle of this, they come to me, who's a disgraced person, well, I never quite left the building, and said, would you feel like going to Dennis Potter and asking him to write something else for us? So they looked that gift horse in the eye, and I went to Dennis, who obviously was waiting for this, and he said, yes, but I want to write a novel for television. I said, Dennis, really, this is a peace offering, and they just want, well, no, I want something big. So I think he was right about that, because I think he believed that forgiveness should never come cheap, and we were allowed to get the money, or to write and deliberate on what we would do, and they asked no questions. And for months, Dennis and I was then back in the fold and was doing other things, were able to muck about and do anything we want without having to report to anyone. And at one point it was going to be a D.H. Lawrence novel, and at another point it was going to be something else. Then it settled into the 30s and it settled into music. And there was a stage at which it could almost have been, although I don't think Potter would ever written a straight biopic, it could almost have been the story of that boat. But I just had another experience in television, which was doing a series of Colin Whelans, totally different kind of world of writing, called The Wild West Show, which was about working class rugby. And